Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We're talking today about moving from preclinical to commercial in the biopharma finance and accounting tech stack. Really excited to be here. It's the Auxilius and Sikich team that is joining you today. Why is this topic important? And for those of you that signed on, I'm sure you can relate and understand this. Zooming out, we see nationally over $100 billion that this industry is attributing to R&D spend and R&D generation, which equates to tremendous amounts of data, everything from safety, efficacy, patient outcomes, manufacturing outputs, commercial pricing, contractual details, financial implications, and much more. For CFOs and controllers, many of you here today come from the finance and accounting organization. This is so important to think about supporting technology as you go through your journey, as your company evolves. And we're going to talk about how you right fit your needs for today while thinking about your needs for tomorrow and anticipating those future inflection points. So that's what we're here today to talk about. So I'm really pleased to be joined by our colleagues. And if we go to the next slide. Yes, so happy to be joined by our colleagues at Sikich. Thank you, Jim Ingram and Adam Wiseman. My name is Sharon Langan. I head up partnerships and community at Auxilius. Adam Wiseman is our co-founder and CEO, and Jim Ingram leads the life science practice at Sikich. So I'll give you guys, if you can, a chance to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, I'll go first briefly. Adam Wiseman, as Sharon said, co-founder and CEO here at Auxilius. Started this business about 3 years ago after dozens of conversations with CEOs, CFOs in this industry specifically, small biotechs and large pharma alike. And I heard versions of the same thing over and over, which is, almost overnight, the second you go into clinic, their jobs change. It's no longer just about science, right? And I think everyone on this call probably feels a version of this or has at one point in their career. You realize all of a sudden you're running a business, you spend much of your time raising capital, signing contracts, paying invoices, signing change orders, and then probably a few more. And then all the while often feel like you lack visibility into the thing that matters most, right? And so that was a really emotional problem we wanted to solve. We also saw a big gap in tool sets, and something we'll touch on in a few capacities today. But everyone in this room is swimming in a sea of logos. I think we'll chat through some of that, right? Dozens of clinical tools. And then, of course, even with a perfectly implemented ERP, what we found is that finance and accounting teams were still managing their single biggest item on their P&L, clinical R&D, outside of those tools manually in Excel. So we built a tool to solve that. If you're not familiar, Auxilius is a finance and accounting platform built for life sciences. We're working with over 60 customers today, 80% of which are publicly traded, help them streamline period close, clinical R&D accruals, of course, manage accurate budgets, and then hold vendors accountable as well. I said it would be brief. Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, that's okay. And hey, everybody, my name is Jim Ingram. I've been with Sikich now for a little over 8.5 years, and I kind of manage our sales here for the NetSuite Life Sciences team. Over these 8.5 years, kind of much like a lot of our life science organizations, we've really continued to evolve. So in addition to kind of working with our clients on the NetSuite side, we make great partnerships like we have here with Auxilius to extend that functionality. And we do a lot more than that as well, right? Over the last few years, we've extended our role here in the life science practice to layer on our regulatory quality and compliance division. So if you have organizations that need to handle things like software validation, quality management, and FDA compliance, we can help you with that. In addition to that, about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, we acquired a small firm to really bring on our data and analytics team. So, handling, big data, small data, really helping our clients deliver strong data packages to their collaborators. Love to get into these conversations we go. But Sharon, I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Jim. As Adam mentioned, there is a sea of logos out there. It's a huge ecosystem of vendors and tools that companies need to consider. It's hard to keep up with that as your company is changing so rapidly and evolving in a really complex industry. So we're here today to try to break that down, and we're going to look at certain archetypes of companies. But when we think about this industry and all of the tech solutions that are out there, look at some of the point solutions there. And how do you navigate this? Depending upon company stage, which we will delve into shortly, companies need to think about their ERP alongside things like finance and accounting point solutions. And that's who's on the line today, is our CFOs, controllers, and their teams. Thinking about usability, scalability, and compatibility. Thinking about these 4 questions. Can we handle it today? Do we need it today? Will it scale as we grow? Can we add functionality in the future? And is this provider nuanced enough and expert enough in life sciences? And that's really a key piece to this. I've been in this industry at the intersect of finance and accounting and life sciences for over 20 years. And there are 2 areas where I have seen it's absolutely critical to have the nuanced expertise in life sciences. And that's in R&D, clinical trial, financial management. There isn't another industry out there like it. So agnostic tools tend to fall short. Similarly, when you look at commercial pricing, government contracting, and overall gross to net management, there's so much specificity to this industry. And so we'll spend a little bit of time on those 2 areas today. So as we go forward, let's talk about why be strategic about your finance and accounting tech decisions. And so a question to both of you, I think there's a lot that we can say about this, Jim and Adam, but why is it so important as finance and accounting leaders that you think strategically, regardless of your stage, if you're preclinical all the way to enterprise level pharma? How do you think about this?
Yeah, and Adam, I can kind of jump in here to start. Please. Really being strategic, especially for pre-revenue life science organizations, incredibly important for you to really plan out those investments to your tech stack, right? So what we see is, I'm sure we all know, life science organizations of all sizes run very lean, especially in the finance department, right? You get your Series A, your Series B, even your Series C, the majority of those funds are raised to go towards furthering the science, not necessarily building out your tech stack. And that's why you need to be very strategic in that. Really kind of evaluating where you are in your life sciences in your life cycle of the organization, and really planning out that next, 6 to 12 as far as 4 years, depending on when you're going to go commercial, and really kind of saying, hey, at what point, what do we need to bring into the tech stack? But Adam?
Yeah, look, I agree. For me, thinking strategically in this context means probably that you are making sure that you are spending your scarce time and resources managing the things that matter to you at that time, right? And it's not always that simple. I think, and I've seen this in the past in my career, I think we all probably wish we had the luxury of thinking further ahead or taking action for the future. We don't have that luxury, right? There's scarce resources and scarce time. So I think it's taking a very objective and sober look at where you are today, what you need today, and where you can, making very thoughtful and strategic investments in the future, right? I think we can all probably know just intuitively, if you're a small phase 1 company with 14 months of runway and you're going to go design a 2-year SAP implementation, that might not be the right thing for your organization, right? And so I think we recognize the trade-offs in the extremes, but there are trade-offs even within a much more narrow spectrum. The key here, and this is true in this industry, we've all seen it, is things just change really quickly, right? And so often you want to think through what are those next milestones, right? If you're planning an IPO in 2 years, you have to work backwards. And it might not be that you need to solve a problem today, but you've just defined the time frame you have to address gaps, certain types of gaps, right? And so I think it's right-sizing tools and making those trade-offs, but also working backwards from key milestones. You have to do both because things do change quickly.
Awesome. Thank you both. I'm going to give a quick plug for all of you here today. We want to hear from you as well. So you're going to hear from Adam, from Jim, from myself, but there's a comment field, a place to ask your questions. Please put those into the chat. We'll do our best to make sure we address those as we go forward. So what we wanted to do is talk about sort of the way we think about 3 biopharma archetypes. Many of you here today are in the middle bucket, the clinical stage, but for early stage innovators, we think of these as, and they are mostly private companies, perhaps only preclinical assets, maybe into safety studies in phase 1. For companies in this stage, it's about meeting milestones, proving out your proof of concept, and allocating precious funds appropriately. Clinical stage biotech. This is a really robust group of companies at this point in time, which is amazing. Tons of innovation coming from this group. Likely public in the past few years, small portfolio of pipeline products, somewhere between phase 1 and 3. And for these companies, we often see that the regulatory rigor is extremely important, because being newly public and sustaining the SEC schedule is a huge hurdle, as well as aligning resources for both current clinical success and future commercial aspirations. And then we are going to talk about commercial stage biopharma, public, oftentimes multinational global companies with a large diversified portfolio, including marketed products. And for companies in this stage, it's about commercial optimization, price point, payer and PBM contracting, commercial compliance, and organizational efficiency. So we'll frame out the conversation today in these 3 categories. But again, mostly what we'll talk about will be the clinical stage biotech.
Yeah, and I think, and Jim, I'll let you chime in here as well, but I think for each archetype, we're going to try to make this very tactical, right? And we're going to try to dive into some of the common tech decisions and decision points, and also trade-offs, right? Cost benefit, but also timing and sequence that companies in these archetypes typically face, right? And these are, I think we can all agree, probably over generalizations. This is a spectrum, but I think really good, hopefully a good lens into this conversation. If you don't find yourself falling in one bucket, you're certainly not crazy.
Or you shouldn't be on this particular webinar, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And anything else, Jim, that just in terms of framing and?
Honestly, I think you set it up really well. I think spending some time on all 3, but specifically the second bucket, I think is really kind of to be the most impactful for folks today.
Yeah.
Great. So we'll talk a little about, start with early stage innovators. Companies here, amazing innovation. Again, meeting that proof of concept and that early milestone, maintaining fundraising is critical. But oftentimes we see, and you maybe can relate if you're on the line and you represent one of these companies, it's about getting the right team in place. Sometimes finance and accounting functions come secondary to the science and to getting the right executives in line. Oftentimes these companies are highly outsourced and leveraging contract expertise in different functional areas, which makes CRO vendor governance very important, given that high percentage of spend on balance to the funds that are available. So we want to talk about some of the tech options here and what you might want to think about as an early stage innovator. Again, given precious funds and having to make choices that fit the needs for today, but also think long term. So, Jim, when you think about companies that might be in this stage, again, basic finance and accounting, especially preclinical trial financial management, it can be difficult to manage. So what is your perspective on that, and how can companies think through what they need to do today, but also anticipating going into the clinic tomorrow?
Yeah, to me, it's all about setting the organization up for the future, right? Having that planning, that future. Oftentimes, I would say, probably at least 75% of the times we're talking to folks that are on QuickBooks, right? Certainly, something like Xero, if they have like an international entity, which we're more likely to see there. And then we are seeing, as we get closer to that 2028 date, we are seeing more Dynamics GP clients start to look and move off, right? So, the thing here is at this stage, everybody is planning for or working towards an equity event, right? Whether that's a Series A, a Series B, whether that is getting, prepared to go public, right? These are all very important things. And when you're on something like a QuickBooks, oftentimes I will say it's sufficient for now, but really, what are those next steps, right? And how do you manage that? Right? How do you keep running lean, but still provide that information, and reporting to leadership, to potential investors? What type of information do you need to provide? What type of visibility do you need? And oftentimes that that discussion will spur whether or not it's the right time to start looking at something like a NetSuite, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And Adam, your perspective on this, like one of the things mentioned here, getting the right talent and team in place is really critical for these companies, which I think puts cap table management sort of high on the list of what you need to consider. What is your perspective on everything from cap table management to also thinking into, clinical trial financial management?
Yeah, I'll start with selfishly with the thing we know best here, but on whether it's preclinical or clinical trial financial management, spend management, that does come all back to trade-offs, right? As we discussed earlier. And so I like to be really honest with the companies we're speaking to in the market. If you're a private phase 1 company or preclinical company and you've got someone incredible on your team who's built a really robust model, it's very likely that despite some potential risks and inefficiencies, that's completely sufficient for where you are, right? I think that's an acknowledgement of what matters. Or at the very least, sometimes companies need to feel that pain or feel that inefficiency before it's worth migrating to a platform. We also see a number of biotechs, again, as you said, Sharon, who are reliant on third-party resources, right? Fractional finance and accounting teams, and that's okay. They're buying expertise and bandwidth with the tool or the methodology secondary. And again, that's actually okay at that stage. We'd be the first to admit that. The considerations I'd say are worth thinking about if you find yourself in that bucket is, one, like, how quickly do things change? We can chat through. I'll give a few examples of I think where there are inflection points. But one thing that you should think about is key man risk, right? This is something actually a few of our customers have raised. We don't talk about this as a value of our platform, but I think everyone here probably understands it intuitively. Excel models are really hard to hand off. The second they break, you effectively have to rebuild them. And so this is something that's true for cap tables. It's also true for clinical trial financial management. Anything that's built in Excel, the right people can do it really well, but there's risk there, right? And if you're using an outside finance or accounting function, think ahead, right? Eventually, at some point, if all goes well and the business exists and thrives, you're bringing those functions in-house. There will be a migration. There will be a transition moment. And so are you migrating a model you don't understand, or is there a baton that's easy to pass? And so those are some of those maybe non-intuitive benefits that are worth thinking about early. On CTFM, or Jim, do you want to chime in on that?
No, you can go ahead. I'll hop on after that. Just want to touch on that.
For CTFM, there's a couple of things I'll just flag as potential accelerators, and we'll probably talk about this in the next archetype. But right, like, everything might be fine in Excel or the way it is today, but the second you add trial volume, the second trial complexity increases, the second you get to change order 22, right? There are a number of things that can change really, really quickly, and so you want to keep an eye out there, right? The best process, the best Excel model will break. Now, on the cap table side, I can speak to this personally. We're a venture-backed startup, but this is another classic thing that you can do in Excel. You can do it well. You can do it fine. I suspect most people on this line already have a cap table management tool in place. We're familiar with Carta. I use it weekly. The thing that's interesting to think about here, when you look at demands on time, at least in my experience, it's typically demand on CEO time or C-suite time because of the nature of the data. It's sensitive, right? So I'd say very likely that's a time burden that needs to shift very quickly. The other thing to think about, and we talked about with CTFM, you will migrate, you will transition. That's an inevitability. And so that work will happen. Moving fast doesn't have a huge cost, right? The cost of most cap table management software is quite tolerable. So you will eventually end up in one. And so I think there's huge benefits. The one thing I will say is an anecdote, don't expect to save money on legal fees. That certainly wasn't our experience.
And Adam, I want to go back to something you kind of mentioned previously around kind of risk, right? So we just this week we had a conversation with a life science organization that's on QuickBooks, and the gentleman I was speaking to even said, hey, realistically, we could probably stay on here, but they're getting hit with material weakness. And that has become a more pressing thing, even for earlier stage, private organizations, leveraging something that provides an audit trail, segregation of duties, accurate controls. Even if you're not a private, these are becoming more and more important to companies, because it's not necessarily about today, which it is for them, but it is, once again, hey, how do we make that transition to a public organization? How do we make that easier?
I'll give an anecdote. I won't use names, so I'm comfortable sharing it. We had a customer very early on. They were small, they were private, but they were ambitious. The CEO, let's put it this way, not a finance or accounting background. Very, very sharp team. We were working with them, and he hated the idea. He hated the burden on the team, even having to think about GAAP accounting, having to think about accruals, right? Not what matters to him, understandably. He said the words, I'll care about GAAP accounting when someone makes me. Now, of course, their outsourced finance partner was on the line and said, has anything changed? You still want to be able to go public in 2 years? He said, yes, right? And so today is that day, right? But sometimes you do have to think ahead to feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great points. And it kind of leads into our next archetype, which is the clinical stage companies. And I think what was mentioned in this conversation is really that risk piece becomes even more pronounced as you're a clinical stage, newly public biotech company. Material weakness is certainly a huge issue. We see that the majority of critical audit matters right now in this industry relate back to clinical trial accruals. So we want to go to the next archetype. But I do want to recognize we have a question in the chat, and I think we'll kind of cover that throughout. But the question is, what is the evolution of ERP in biotech, from Post-it note to Excel to QuickBooks to NetSuite to SAP? So I think, Jim, you kind of touched a little bit on that, like where QuickBooks might fall short, even if you are early stage innovator. But we will talk about how that ERP evolution exists, and Jim is the right person and works with hundreds of companies in that evolution. But when
we'll definitely cover that in the next kind of archetype, and really talk about some things that have been changing in the last few years too. So
yep. Awesome. So thank you for the question. Audience, please keep them coming, send them into the chat, and we will, again, make sure that we address as many or all to the best of our ability. So let's talk about clinical stage biotech. We'll spend more time here. Why? Because this is really the horsepower of this industry right now. There's been over 200 companies that have gone public since 2020, the majority of which are clinical stage. Many are readying for commercial launch, but not there yet. So for these companies, and not to overgeneralize, but typically you see, clinical outputs are a value inflection point, and so clinical trial success is critical at this stage. Also, we see what is pivotal is the need for growth at scale. So as these companies are, managing their clinical trials, anywhere from perhaps 1 to 5, 6 clinical trials, it's also looking forward to commercial launch, because that's, of course, the ultimate goal. And for that, it's usually about an 18 to 24 month out review of the tool sets that support gross to net and commercial readiness and revenue recognition. But also on the risk standpoint, these companies are in a can't miss point from a regulatory standpoint. Internal control over financial reporting is paramount here. And again, critical audit matters tend to exist around our outsourced R&D spend and clinical trial accruals. This is where some of the gaps in industry agnostic tools tend to really expose some of that risk. So we want to spend a little bit more time here. So Jim, I'll start with you. What do you see as the biggest capabilities that this type of company needs at that moment?
Yeah, it's really twofold. Number one, leveraging the right ERP that can handle those things, like we talked about, segregation of duties, audit controls, SOX compliance, right? So, and then number two, it is, not to be a little cheeky here, because we're talking about Auxilius as well, is about really accurately handling that clinical trial, like financial management, right? So we even on the first side, when we're talking about even preclinical, handling that accrual counting is so incredibly important, and is honestly one of the reasons why we've partnered with the folks here at Auxilius.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. And at this point, how does a conversation, back to you, Jim, around ERP start to change as companies think about if they are still on QuickBooks, or, where do you advise companies in their ERP journey?
Yeah, so at this point, if they're already in the clinic, it's a really good conversation, especially if they're on something like QuickBooks, right? Because number one, they're public, and quite honestly, they shouldn't be on QuickBooks, right? For all the things that we've already talked about, just handling SOX compliance. And then oftentimes, where the next step is in the ERP landscape is, hey, have you had the discussion internally around commercialization? And will you be outsourcing, to 3PLs and CMOs, or are you going to be bringing that in-house for manufacturing? Those are really the two biggest discussions. And, if we get into a discussion and they say, hey, they start talking about what does commercialization mean like for them, depending on how that goes, there might be a different recommendation than what we would typically think of.
Yeah. Yep. And Adam, at Auxilius, we're working across nearly 60 biopharma companies today. How does a conversation around clinical trial financial management fit into this equation? And what have you seen to be sort of one of the single biggest headache for companies that find themselves in this moment? They're clinical stage, they haven't yet gone commercial.
I think, I mentioned a few of them earlier, but everything's fine until it's not, right? And the question is, what's going to break a manual process? And there's a whole bunch of things, right? It might be study count. What you can do really well for one study that you all understand, you can't do for 10, right? What you can do for a phase 1, you probably can't manage with the same level of granularity and rigor for complex phase 3 studies, right? With hundreds of sites and thousands of patients, and a few extra zeros on the costs, right? And so I think it's really a question of, at what scale does your current process break, right? And just recognizing that it will happen. It's not bad, but it will happen, right? And I think you can take a little bit of inefficiency. You can throw people at a problem. That's what we're all here for, right? But I think there's a time where that cost becomes untenable, right? And as you say, it might be that you're spending 10 hours a month, 20 hours a month per study managing clinical R&D accruals, just for example, and as an example, forget planning, right? Go multiply that by 10. That's a big drain on your team. There's more important work to do. And so I think it's a function of, at scale, when does this break, right? You can't afford the resources anymore to manage more complex or greater volume of studies. And two, that risk changes as well. Sharon talked about it a little bit, right? But dollars go up. These costs become very material for public companies. It's the single largest, most material item. It's the most existential, the only existential item in your P&L, right? Everything's banking on clinical R&D success. Sharon mentioned critical audit matters. Yeah, there's accounting risk, there's compliance risk, there's SEC risk, there's auditor risk. There's another type of risk too that I think is worth acknowledging, right? Even if you don't have to put the right processes in place from an accounting perspective, I would argue, and I think a lot of our clients feel the same way, if you don't do this well, if you're not managing your clinical spend well, it is also unlikely that you're managing your vendors the way you'd like to, that you're managing risk, that you're managing runway. And so we think risk has a few different flavors here, but I think scale is when existing processes break.
Yep, absolutely. And one thing too, companies at this stage, again, aiming for commercial launch. If you have a phase 3 and you're thinking forward, I'm about to launch in the next 12 months, that also brings on a whole new host of headaches and challenges and talent need. Spending time in certain categories, doing manual, rote processes and activities where you could lean into a tool, that's kind of where I think the tech stack planning comes into play. Jim, what are your thoughts on that? Like, thinking about the categories here as you right size as an organization, where should companies, or where can companies think about leveraging automation and tools to be able to bring in talent and resources in other?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we often see. And once again, I can kind of talk a little bit about. So we have a predefined solution for pre-revenue life science organization that we've developed on NetSuite. And part of that is a small tool that we built internally on NetSuite which allows you to handle accrual counting, prepaids and accruals. It works really well. We typically say it's great for preclinical, right? So that big inflection point, it's when you're going into the clinic, and especially when you have several and you're getting more and more of these, because while it's a good tool in NetSuite, there still is some manual manipulation to it, right? So that is that perfect time to fully automate it and look at something like, I don't want to do an advertisement for you guys, but honestly for us, our recommendation for a lot of our clients is that is when you want to look at automating the tool, and that tool would be you guys. So.
Yeah. And in terms of timing and cadence, we often hear, as companies are perhaps going into a NetSuite implementation, when is the right time to introduce and implement other industry-specific point solutions that might complement and support their processes? Jim, you work across hundreds of companies. How would it, and Adam, same to you, like, how do you think about sort of the timing and also considering change management as part of that equation?
I'll tell you, change management is often one of the most undervalued aspects of any implementation, right? So it's one of the things that we really try to bring up early and often to get them to think about. We see it a lot of times here. So one of the things when we're talking to people, whether it's before they implement with us or after, they ask a lot of different questions in, say, certain things around the procurement process, right? So should we look at, X, Y, or Z? If they're on Prendio, should you look at something else? And a lot of times it's, hey, are you ready to go through that change management? Because, especially I would say in the procurement, because you get these lab techs, these scientists that all they care about and all they should care about is furthering the science, doing their work. The last thing they want to do is learn a new system, right? So companies really have to think if they can take that change management on. And it's a good exercise that we really like to sit down and evaluate with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll add a couple of things. I'll try to speak generally first, and then I can opine on the experience with Auxilius especially. But I think one of the things we see a lot, right, and Sharon, I think your question, right, it's framing how and when do you sequence parallel priorities and efforts, right? One of the things I see come up a lot, right, is that it's that question, right? And a lot of people we meet early on, they've been burned before, right? Or they've been through an implementation, maybe an ERP in a past life, that is coloring your view of what it will take to get the next tool up and running. And so I think that's a really healthy skepticism to have. I think you have to, right? Because people will tell you and sell you anything. I would say, though, do the work to understand what's truly required, right? If you are using a bad implementation you had 2 years ago in a previous role for a different tool, that might not be the right benchmark. Not all tools or teams are equal. I'd also work with, vendors and implementation partners, right? And Jim's given an example, I think, of where there are benefits of consolidating change management. That's a really good reason to potentially bite two things off at once. And so I would work with partners who know those tools well. And in the case of Auxilius, right, like there are benefits to implementing alongside NetSuite. Jim just gave probably the biggest reason, and there are others. The other thing that comes up quite a bit is, hey, I'm on QuickBooks. I'm not mid NetSuite implementation, so it's not a question around doing two things together. It's I'm currently on QuickBooks. We are not doing our NetSuite implementation for another 8 months. Why get set up and running now? I want to wait until we get NetSuite going, right? Is there a dependency question? What I'd say is, again, whether it's Auxilius or another tool, do the work to understand the connection points before you assume it's a big deal. You might not have to wait for the benefit. In the case of Auxilius, our connection point to ERP is quite routine, right? We need invoices and POs. Doing that mapping, if you consider it a re-implementation, might take a few days. It's the change management that is the bulk of that implementation. So I would say whether it's Auxilius or another tool, ask the questions, get into the details, because you might not have to wait.
Yeah, and I would say oftentimes if they're on QuickBooks and they're looking to implement with Auxilius, at that point their pain is probably greater on the clinical trial financial management than it is replacing QuickBooks. So I would say don't wait, right? Go forward with that now.
And look, the cost of inaction, if it is a pain, there's a cost of inaction. And I think the cost of re-implementing or remapping could be real. I don't want to say it's not, but put that on your vendors, right? Make that their problem, make that our problem.
And then one thing I'd kind of touch on too that you mentioned is selecting the right partner. I'm a firm believer that selecting the right partner is just as, if not more important than selecting the right solution in many of things, especially in ERP, right? Working with somebody who has that industry experience that can take you right from start to finish rapidly and successfully.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. Quick pause for the audience. Any questions? Again, just put them in the chat. We'll make sure we address them. But anything else, Jim, Adam, that we want to touch on looking at these tech options?
There's, I guess, one or two other things I would mention, right? When you talk about when you start to feel pain, whether it's ERP or in our case CTFM, right? There's probably a couple less obvious pain points or triggers that might make you wonder if now's the time. Sometimes it's coordination across teams, right? So as you grow, and we certainly see this in mid-market, we see this in commercial or pharma customers as well. The bigger teams get, the harder and also the more important coordination becomes, right? If you imagine, our archetype of 20 brilliant, motivated people sitting in Cambridge, Mass, right? You enroll a patient, you ring a bell. Everyone knows what's going on. You've got a real-time pulse on health of the trial, on vendor, on clinical operations, on costs. That changes as you get bigger, right? And so I'd say coordination as you start to functionalize, as teams grow, as teams start increasingly to speak different languages to one another across clinical, finance, and accounting. That's another time where Excel is just a bad tool, whether it's cap table management or study budgets. It's not built for that. So I'd say team coordination is another thing you might just start to see symptoms. And the other thing, we talked about change orders, but I'll zoom out. It's if you don't feel like you have visibility or control, that's another moment where it's not about time. It's a more foundational problem, right? This is too important not to feel like you understand drivers of change, changes in your study, right? If you are on change order 22 and you're still caught by surprise, it's probably time to look for a tool.
Yep. Thank you both. And I'll say it again, companies at this stage, clinical stage biotech, you're newly public, value inflection points really rest on clinical output and clinical data. And so that coordination between teams, having your finger on the pulse of what's happening within your trial from the finance and accounting standpoint is critical, as that's really where value inflection points live. So we'll on that, we'll move over to commercial stage biopharma, enterprise level companies, multinational pharma biotech companies balancing commercial products, as well as maintaining an active R&D pipeline. Oftentimes that's via M&A or in licensing deals to keep that pipeline robust. But optimization of commercial activities is critical at this point, particularly if you're in a competitive therapeutic category and there's tremendous payer pricing pressures that are hitting companies today. From a tech stack planning perspective, within finance and accounting, commercial stage and enterprise level companies can benefit immensely from tools that can scale laterally across the organization. So Adam, to your point, how can you sort of create better coordination and optimization within teams and capture material efficiencies? And I think efficiency is a really huge gain for these companies. So thinking about, at this stage, if companies were on NetSuite, for example, Jim, what would you say are the biggest capabilities that this type of company needs at that point as they go into the commercial realm?
Yeah, so now you're looking at your ERP from, say, a little bit more simpler, right? Your more core financials, your GL, your AP, your purchasing, integrations to your CTFM. And then now you're really going and having to handle complex issues like inventory and supply chain, manufacturing, whether that be outsourced or fully insourced, handling, really fun things like gross to net, right, with your rev rec. Really leveraging solutions that can handle all of these. That is, and now it's not, you're not preparing for your future. This is your future. This is essentially, for the lack of a better term, your end stage of the life cycle of the organization. right? So, and then really, to me, the biggest thing around whether or not you should stay on something like NetSuite or move to a tier one solution like Oracle, SAP, or Microsoft really comes down to manufacturing, inventory, and supply chain. It really does. But I would say internally, if you're doing, and this is kind of goes into the comment from earlier, absolutely, I would say, pre-COVID, and I'm just using that as 2020, I would say 100%. Gene, you have that question, you have that right? From Post-it note to Excel to QuickBooks to NetSuite to something like SAP, right? With the advent, and I don't know if it was directly tied to COVID or it just happened naturally, but really around COVID, we started to see a lot more of fully remote life science organizations, even when they go commercial, fully outsourcing to 3PLs and CMOs. So realistically, at that point, you don't necessarily have to leave NetSuite at all, because at the end of the day, you're just getting your finished goods. You're working with, you can almost upload a journal entry back into your ERP. Now, I would say if you're outsourcing it, that's when we're having a larger discussion, right? So what does your demand plan look like? What is your MRP going to look like? If, that's when you really want to have a question around, will NetSuite suffice, or are we looking to go tier one or integrate to an MES or a GTN solution?
Jim, just pure curiosity here, but for folks on the line who are thinking about that migration to a tier one tool, are you seeing any trends in market or shifts around kind of like the viability of each of those three options you mentioned? Are there new players who are flexing up and can handle? Are you seeing any big trends over the last 10 years that would change how people should think about those options?
Yeah, and I think it's even closer to that,
really
with the last 5 years, right? So, and I think a big part of it is, we have probably about 20 to 30 commercial life science companies. And I would say 75% of them fully outsourced, right, to 3PLs and CMOs. But we do have a number of commercial companies that are doing full in-house manufacturing. So, so NetSuite has built more robust tools. They have extended their run rate in terms of their demand planning from 12 months to 48 months. So, they have done that. They are trying to keep folks on NetSuite. I know you say a migration, just if you're going from a NetSuite to an Oracle, obviously, or a NetSuite to SAP, just understand it is a full boat, brand new implementation. You are looking at a best case scenario, 12 to 18 month implementation, $2+ million. It's probably on the low end. And here's the thing: you're always going to have folks in this space who equate success with Oracle or SAP, and we get it, right? So we have to adjust and help them make that transition from NetSuite to something else as easy as possible.
And Jim, given that, again, since 2020, since COVID, there was a flurry of IPO activity in that year, and we're starting to see a rebound to some degree in the IPO market, but over 200 companies have gone public in the bioscience space in just a short period of time. Many of them are on or going to NetSuite. Would you expect, or can we maybe surmise that there will be sort of a higher that they will stay on NetSuite, and there will be less of a ratio of this industry going on to the SAPs and others?
Yeah, and then honestly, yes, and I think it goes to the biggest trend, kind of going back to what Adam asked, was outsourcing everything, right? So I think a lot of organizations are now saying, hey, if the complexity isn't there like it was in years past, then we can just leverage the tools that NetSuite has. They have a very good outsourced manufacturing piece where it allows you to build tighter integrations and connections with your 3PLs and your CMOs, so you can have better visibility. And you can do it in terms of kind of whip at your CMO, but not everybody wants or needs that. Right. So we have some clients that have been commercial for a long time where it's fully outsourced to a 3PL. Not only do they do the manufacturing, they do the distribution and the sales. And on month end, they get a journal entry they upload into NetSuite. It's about as simple as it possibly can get.
It keeps it streamlined. Adam, question for you. So, at Auxilius, I know it was a bit of an aha moment to realize that, enterprise level pharma contends with the same challenges and headaches that smaller biotech deals with in the clinical trial financial management space and those accruals, certainly at a different scale. But anything to consider there in terms of what companies are driven by and what they should think about from a tech standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, a few thoughts. I mean, the need changes a little bit, not a lot, but it does change a little bit, right? In the sense that it is likely that no single study is material, depending on scale of the organization and on the revenue side. Like it may well be that clinical R&D is not material, but the dollars are huge, right? And so the need shifts, and I would say that the cost of managing clinical R&D poorly is actually much higher, right? Even if it is not material in the same way to your auditors or to your organization. What we typically see is, I mean, if we're talking kind of enterprise pharma, we've talked to a number of them. If you have built in-house tools, but like kind of duct tape onto SAP or their ERP, generally working with outside consulting firms. So, $2, $5, $10 million of spend to try to make it work for them. To manage the R&D, clinical R&D accruals. What we find is if you just go a level below the surface, they're still doing it manually in Excel, right? And so I think this problem continues to exist. The nature of the problem is different. The biggest difference is they can throw people at it, right? Pharma has the resources to do that. The bigger you get, the more inefficiencies you can handle. Doesn't mean it's good, right? And so say the problem changes, but the flavor of the problem changes. The problem is the same. Some of the things we talked about mid-market, when you start to hit those breaking points, right? Coordination, talk about coordination problems, right? You may be spread out globally at this point. Teams that have to work together that have never met. We've met and worked with customers that have 18 people who touch a single study tracker file every single month to get to an expense estimate, right? So it's not too different from building a nuclear weapon, right? Nobody has the complete, it's a bad analogy, but nobody has the complete picture, right? And that can be, it's time consuming, and I think outcomes are worse for it. So coordination, much more important, right? How do you free up time? Not because they can't afford it, but because there are much more strategic uses of time. The opportunities to think strategically when you're operating at this scale are massive, right? And so it's not just about FTEs, it's not just about time.
Yeah. And then I think back 10, 15 years ago, in this industry, there wasn't really a gross to net point solution market at that point. And I think similarly, there was so much time being spent with trying to manage in Excel cross-functionally. And it just gets to a point where it's not sustainable. So I think at that commercial level, it's just, you start to look at efficiency at scale. So we have a few minutes left. Again, any questions, pop them into the chat. But just to kind of wrap things up and ask some ending questions. Jim, I'll start with you. How often do you think companies should be pulse checking their tech stack plan?
Bare minimum once a year. I would say, having what we try to do with our managed services clients on the life sciences space is have kind of quarterly business reviews, really to understand, hey, what are those issues going on now? What are you planning for in the future? The more often you can have that, the better you'll be, and honestly, the easier it will be for you to plan for whether things that are coming up, or like Adam said earlier, things move so fast, right, in this industry, that if you aren't thinking ahead, you're going to be left behind.
Yeah. And then in terms of the tech planning journey, what do you see to be questions that are most under asked or considerations that are overlooked?
Yeah, in terms of planning for any type of project, I think I already mentioned it, right, is kind of around the change management. But also too, like I think a couple of things that people kind of underestimate, the importance of project management, not just from the partner side, but also from the client side, like really having that point person on both sides to keep each other honest and on task and on deadline. And then testing and training. Number one, you've got to test your system especially your business processes, even working with partners. They'll never know your business processes or your business as well as you do. And then, it really training, right? So you could spend all the money in the world on the best solution, but if you don't properly train your users, you'll never get the user adoption, and it's just going to be wasted money.
And then lastly, any future tool advancements that really excite you, that you think companies should have on their radar if they don't already?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a tough one. I will say this, within NetSuite, they actually have what they call suite procurement coming out in their next release this fall. To me, I'm incredibly interested to see how that goes. So part of what they're going to be rolling out is actually punch out services, right? So having those automated catalogs. There's always been point purchasing solutions that leverage that and then easily integrate to NetSuite. I'm interested to see, number one, does NetSuite get it right? And number two, if they do, how does that impact that landscape? That is something that is really interesting to see what's going to happen over the next year and a half.
And then we have a question here, and this is, I think we can all relate to this. As the number of software solutions grows, you end up with a mess of disconnected data. So in terms of integration, can you comment? I think both Adam, Jim, how do you think about that? How should executives think about the integration and the connectivity between so many different tool sets?
Yeah. And if you want, I can start. And I'll start when you're a commercial company, right? Because as you grow and scale and you become a global commercial life science organization selling product, that could be your inflection point to go to a tier one solution and to do more, right? However, there's a cost to doing so. Now, I'll always say, there's, and it's not just NetSuite, there's other mid-market ERPs out there that, they're built to be often very good at certain things, but they're built to also be integrated to best of breed solutions. And those integrations now are so much better and easier and more stable to maintain than they were 10, 15 years ago. So I guess to me, part of it is, how many do you have? If you have 20, if you have 15, I'd say, yeah, we want to have a discussion because maybe that's not the best. If you have, 3 to 5 to 8, it's really understanding, hey, what do they do, and what do those integration flows need to be from those individual systems into your ERP, and honestly, whether is it a unilateral or bilateral connection that you need.
Mm-hmm. That I have a few thoughts here. Everyone wants to be your source of truth, right? You only need one source of truth for each truth, right? And so you don't want forked views of your patient enrollment, assumptions. You don't want forked views of your budget or your forecast. For core ERP elements, you don't want forked views of things that matter to you, right? And so what I would say is, it's not so much the number of tools, but it's what are the overlaps and intersection points. And you want to be thoughtful there, because you might be buying a source of truth. You might be buying data unification. You might be buying the right workflow tool for a very specific problem and use case. And you want to think about those things in conjunction. I don't think there's a such thing as too many workflow tools that solve the right problem, but they have to play nice together. And the other things I can say is, make it your vendor's problem, right? If you think there's risk there, if you think your tool stack's getting too big and there aren't clear lines, make that your vendor's problem. Most tools, if not off the shelf with very little configuration, can map to the tool that you do want to be your source of truth, right? Auxilius is just an example. We pull from EDC, we pull and push to ERP. We don't force you to change your data hierarchy, your nomenclature. We map to your general ledger structure, your journal entry upload files, right? We're a workflow tool. We can centralize and unify data, but we are not going to fork it. I would demand that and ask that of your vendors. The other thing I'd say, and I mostly see this in enterprise pharma, but there's a little bit of this inflection point where I'd say over the last 10 years, and Jim, you've probably seen this trend play out over a longer period, but I think you had a lot of people consolidating tool sets to simplify and standardize. And now, as you see really robust data lakes evolve, people are building their own data warehouses and APIs. It actually unlocks the ability to go work with small point solutions that are great at specific things. And so I don't think there's a right or wrong, but it's certainly something that you want to force your vendors to clarify.
Yeah. And we have a question here, which is one challenge regarding clinical financial planning is existing tools lack the capacity to plan holistically with direct fees, pass-throughs, and investigator grants. And the question is there a solution on the horizon that a potential single tool could provide all of that?
Yeah, so we're working on that. Absolutely, right. And I'd say Auxilius was built first and foremost to handle an ongoing study, right? But if you look at the full life cycle of what it takes to both plan, contract, manage, close out studies, we've got a lot of features to build, and those are in process. So happy to share more. But yeah, look, I think that's the reason why we exist. At least there isn't a tool that manages it. I think a lot of people on this line, especially if you've dabbled or played a heavy role in the clinical side of clinical trials or clinical operations or clinical business operations, you may be familiar with some of those grant management tool. I think there's some great planning tools when you need a very, very granular answer before a contracting moment. But when you're 2 years out and your board's asking you for a quarterly budget estimate and your ClinOps colleagues don't even know what the heck protocol is going to look like, those states of mind are at odds, right? And so I think there is an opportunity to build a tool from the planning and operating perspective that manages the whole the fulsomeness of what a study actually is. So short answer is we do a lot of that today, and I think you'll see a lot of that over the next 6 months.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. Well, with that, I don't see any other questions from the audience, but it was great to have this conversation with you both today, and thank you all for joining and tuning in. We hope to hear from you, so don't be shy. Please reach out to both Jim, Adam, and myself. But thank you all for your time today.
So,
thank you very much. Thanks.